There we go. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the MakerDAO Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting number 102, taking place on Thursday, July 23rd at 4 p.m. UTC. Welcome everyone. We're joined by 40 people currently, still climbing. So thank you all for coming. I'll go over the, oh sorry, I'm, my name is Long for Wisdom, the governance facilitator, or one of the governance facilitators for MakerDAO. I'll be chairing the meeting. I will briefly go through the agenda and then we will get started. So let's see, today we've got Rich Brown's going to give a brief announcement at the beginning of this call. We're going to have me doing governance at a glance, as usual. We're going to have Money Supply giving a brief vault compensation update. We're going to spend a bit of time discussing the PSM and the votes and the news from the foundation. We've got Charles, who's going to give us a weekly MIPs update, as usual. I'm going to do the governance poll review as part of the facilitators' requirements according to the MIPs process. We've got, from smart contracts, we've got Will giving an update on the LEN token, which was recently, well, an upgrade is planned, which affects some of our plans with that token. Nick has a brief thing to say about Gitcoin for oracles. And then we're going to finish off with State of the Peg from Vishesh, as usual. All right. Okay, let's get started. Rich, are you good to do your thing?
I believe so. Zoom is behaving strangely, so let me know if I lag or my sound is off. Presumably everything's fine. All right, no complaints. I'll assume that I am not talking to myself. So I do have an announcement. I am stepping away from my role at the foundation at the end of the month. I'm moving on to a different role, which is an extended amount of doing absolutely nothing, which I'm enormously looking forward to. So that presents some really interesting shifts in the paradigm of what's going on in the governance ecosystem and the foundation and a bunch of other things too, because I had a habit of sticking my nose in all over the place. Happily though, part of this transition, it's been in the works for a while. It's not a last minute decision. It's the most amicable moving on process I've ever been involved with, and probably the most bittersweet, but mostly sweet, because of the teams that I'm handing off responsibilities to. Fantastically talented individuals have been attracted to this ecosystem. The work that they do and blows me away month to month. In the context of these calls, the person I am talking about specifically is obviously Long for Wisdom, who came into the ecosystem a while ago and has moved from success to success to success and has been an absolute rock star governance facilitator. So I can sort of hand off the mantle of responsibility, knowing that the person who's taking over those responsibilities not only has taken them over months ago, I think people might have noticed, but is doing a far better job than I ever did, and it's what the community deserves. So it's a really cool opportunity for me to take the opportunity to catch up on some sleep, and so that's the situation. So I think that, well, I don't want to, there's a lot of things to go over in this call. I don't want to monopolize, which is probably the last time you guys are going to hear me say that there's a lot of cool things to go over in this call and I don't want to monopolize. Well, I just go ahead and do it anyways. We're going to, as part of Long for Wisdom's transition from mentor to master, is officially firing me. And that's going to be a tremendously healthy activity for the ecosystem, because MakerDAO, or sorry, the Maker Foundation, I forgot which hat I was wearing for that second there. The Maker Foundation, its responsibility is to decentralize itself and to bootstrap the protocol, and also to bootstrap the ecosystem. And the way that we do that is We work with the community to identify roles and responsibilities. We help formalize those things. We work with community members to establish what those things actually mean. We help out as much as possible, and then we step away. And this is a fantastically healthy example of that, because back in the olden days, when we started off these calls, it was me and a couple other people awkwardly staring at each other, trying to figure out whether there's anything worth talking about when it comes to governance. That has obviously iterated a bit. And so now we're looking at a call where there's 51 people anxiously waiting for me to stop talking so we can get into the issues at hand. The handoff process has arrived. And so this is a perfect example of the foundation taking this opportunity to step away, because this process is working. So Long for Wisdom will be expanding his team of governance facilitators. He's also put out a call for help. So Help Wanted is there too. So if you think you can help out with governance, please reach out to him. I think I will, yeah, I have a tendency, I want to leave on a super high note and do some self-congratulate. Well, I shouldn't have said that, not self-congratulation. To congratulate the community on what it's accomplished here too. Maybe I will, just very briefly. I touched on it already, but at the very beginning, there was a question, like, is there something worth talking about here? Should we have a call maybe every week to talk about this? I'm like, oh, every week, what are we going to talk about? There can't be that much going on. How that situation has evolved. But the work I did at the foundation and with the community has been some of the most rewarding work I've ever done. And if you guys knew how old I actually was, you understand how much weight that carried. The things that we're doing in this governance ecosystem can feel like a slog sometimes. It can feel a bit chaotic sometimes, but it's important to remember that when we all got started, DeFi wasn't a meme yet. Community governance, obviously we didn't invent it, but in the crypto space, it was largely unheard of. And the constant iteration, the passion and intelligence and work that the community has brought to the table here has not only created something special and important for the Maker protocol, but it doesn't take, you don't have to cast your eyes too far to notice that there's 5 or 6 other protocols that have governance now as well. And it looks a lot suspiciously like Maker governance with some tweaks and some optimizations, but the principles, the basic frameworks were all sort of, not all sort of, many of them were discovered in these calls and in our forums and in our chats because of the work of the team, of the people that come to these calls every week. And so maybe take a moment to congratulate yourselves on the fantastic amount of work that has happened here. I know that I will be congratulating myself secretly and congratulating you guys as well. I think, yeah, I'll leave it there. So I'm going to be around. I'm going to transition from whatever, well, the interim governance facilitator role into the role of a community member. And I'll be joining the rank and file, which is going to be, I think, the most fun chapter yet. So I think that's where I want to leave everything. So thanks to Long for Wisdom for picking up the mantle, and thanks to this community for doing something really amazing here. All right, that's it for my sincerity. And I hope I didn't get too emotional. Long, right. I know how it upsets you. Back to you.
No, it's I finally get to do it back, which is great. So yeah, I mean, Rich, you've been like a massive part of this community since I joined. Seeing you on the governance calls and everyone else on the governance calls from the beginning is one of the reasons that I got involved, because everyone was kind of talking about everything so reasonably, generally. There's a lot of interesting discussion going on, and I know you're a big part of putting that together. So like on a personal note, thank you, and I'm sure the community very much appreciates your efforts as well. If anybody else wants to come in and embarrass Rich, now is a good time.
you guys can stew on it as well. Yeah, so I think that, I just want to keep on, or just touch on that point again, is that this is this great inflection point where it's time for the second, newer, more energetic generation, I think, to take over. And so long for Wisdom and the rest of the team. Lots of people on this call have been deeply engaged with governance and actually actively governing the ecosystem, putting forth proposals, coming up with new initiatives, refining the way that we think about things. This is just, it's a great opportunity to step back and watch other people do some work. So, all right, thanks again. We can move on now if you want. Well,
Yeah, I think we will. Everyone's free to obviously make their own, leave messages for Rich and things in the usual ways. Cool. Okay, we will move on to governance at a glance then. All right. So let's see, this week, most of the active discussions have been focused around around the PEG, around the PSM concept, around other options we could take to move the PEG in the right direction. Of specific note are the posts from Rune that went live just yesterday, talking about the Foundation's focus over the next few months, and explaining why the Foundation will no longer be working on the PSM. In case any of you weren't aware, I would recommend quickly browsing that thread before we get into discussions. I will link it in the chat. So in addition to that, there have been a couple of threads that have continued. One has been the negative DSR/TRFM threads, combined with the MIP20 proposal from Lev. So there's been a lot of discussion around kind of other options in terms of implementing negative rates, which has been good to see. In terms of signal requests, again, there's still quite a few of these going. So a couple of weeks ago, Joshua asked if we should increase the duration of the governance security module delay. That's failed. We've got a couple moving on chain next week, which will be adjusting the TUSD debt ceiling to 0, based on the aftermath of them upgrading the token. The smart contract team thinks that that's probably a wise call. Then we had another one that's going on. Actually, yeah, the other one moving on chain is the WBTC debt ceiling increase, which I just realized I've left out of governance at a glance, prompted by Andy, which also got on chain on Monday. In the forum, there's still two or three, a couple of signal requests continuing, particularly adjusting the ZRX and KNC risk premiums from money supply, and a signal request to lower the USDC-A liquidation ratio and risk premium from SAMM, also known as Exnod. So keep an eye out for those and go and vote and share your opinion, as you usually do. One last thing I'd like to highlight is just something which I already mentioned, which was that I posted a help wanted for governance help, which ironically I decided to do a day before I realized Rich was leaving, but becomes even more important now that I found that out. So if you want to get involved more in governance, then please drop me a line. Okay, what should we move on to now? Let's get the MIP stuff out of the way, and then we can get on to the more meaty things. So Charles, do you want to do your updates?
Yep. Could I share my screen?
You can, but Rich will need to allow you because, yeah,
Perfect. Okay, so the weekly MIPS update. Long already covered a couple of the details, but I'll just jump in to talk about what has happened this week and what we will be doing on today's call. So on Monday, the monthly MIPS governance poll was published for 5 proposals specifically. That was, I believe, initially there were 7, so 5 got rejected from the actual governance poll itself. And the poll did pass unanimously with 18,000 1,000 MKR in support and 0 no votes, which is great to see. So today, Long for Wisdom and Rich will perform that review as part of this meeting to basically give the go-ahead for Monday's executive vote happening on July 27th. In terms of next week's activity, so we have the executive vote to officially ratify those 5 proposals will be published. And I do want to note, I always make this reminder, but the vote will have an expiration of 4 days, and after which it will have no effect. So if it doesn't pass within those 4 days, the proposals at hand will effectively be rejected. So it is important to vote when the MIPS executive does go out in as soon as possible to make sure that the proposals we want to effectively become law or technical implementations to get added to the protocol and governance. Then next Thursday is the final meeting of the July's governance cycle, where we'll do a review of what happened throughout the month. Basically look at what worked and what didn't. Maybe we can consider some amendments to certain processes, but really it's the time to summarize and discuss what happened and also look at future opportunities for August's governance cycle, and maybe look at the potential submissions or which of the requests for comment proposals are ready for August, or if they'll be delayed it for another month or so based on the request for comment period of time. In other news, more specifically with collateral onboarding, we have the MANA collateral type moving to the executive vote on Monday, which means that it could be added to the protocol over the next week or two, depending on the time the vote actually passes and when the spell is cast. In terms of lend, there was a recent update. I think will be giving more details about this, but there are some considerations to keep in mind that the domain teams have been thinking about with respect to the token upgrade from lend to Aave that will be happening, I think, towards the end of the summer. And then lastly, the 11 collateral onboarding community greenlight polls are live. So they're going. Go ahead and vote on which ones you think are great opportunities for Maker to consider. And those will end in approximately 11 days. So as we know, MIP 17 got rejected from the governance cycle this month, and whether that was because it wasn't completely supported with answering questions, or maybe it wasn't the perfect solution for fulfilling Maker's needs, I want to hold a working group call next Tuesday about how we can improve and modify this proposal. Some considerations could be just using it to modify debt ceiling adjustments rather than pairing both the DC and risk premium adjustments. But I want to take this time to work with the community on really improving this proposal so that we can get a solution in place for quicker adjustments of specific parameters that the Maker protocol considers. So I'll post those details in the forums and in Rocket Chat, and so keep an eye out for that. And just on that note, before I get into the next slide here, is if there is a proposal that has been rejected from the governance cycle and you're the author or you really support it, really consider holding a call or even doing a forum thread on how we can improve the proposal, because the onus is always on the author to propose it, get it reproposed, sorry. So by holding these working groups, you can really work with the people in the community who have stake in that type of expertise. So I just wanted to remind everyone that it is on the author and that they should take the initiative. And if an author does not want to do that, they can definitely transition their ownership of the proposal over to someone who would like to lead it going forward. In terms of the recent activity in the world of MIPS, there was nothing new this week, but I do want to provide a reminder that there is MIP 20 proposed by Levin Rain for the Vox module that isn't RFC. There has been a ton of discussion on it, but if you haven't checked it out, go ahead. And also the one by Akiva for the Declaration of Intent subproposal under MIP 13 is also in request for comments. So go ahead and check that out as well if you haven't had the opportunity. In terms of TUSD, we had a forum poll go out last week and it concluded yesterday. The next steps for that are to publish a governance poll on Monday to lower the TUSD debt ceiling to 0, I believe. And if that passes, it will proceed to a weekly executive on the following Friday. As Long mentioned earlier in this call, there is an update regarding the PSM. So the poll that went out on Monday has passed. So this does show that the community wants the PSM in some form. However, there was a post that went out by Rune, I believe it was yesterday, that in short talks about how the foundation will not be building the PSM and looking at the next steps for the foundation in terms of making Maker self-sustainable and our path towards that. So that concludes my update for today. I will post all these details in my weekly update on the forums, including anything that I missed. So that is it.
All right, thank you very much, Charles. I'll just briefly do the governance poll review. As Charles said, the poll passed 18,000 Maker to in favor and 0 Maker against. And I don't see any reason to prevent that from continuing to the executive. So it will continue in the executive on Monday, as according to the MIPs process. Interesting. So, so Sam has just informed me that the PSM poll did not pass. That it ended 50.04% against, which is perhaps the closest poll we've had thus far. Is that correct?
Okay, sorry for that. I checked, I think with 5 minutes left to go, and it wasn't. So thanks for that correction.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is very split. It is 19,755.05 to yes, 19,784.11 to no. Okay, we will talk about that more in a little bit, I think, hopefully. Let's see what else we got on the agenda. Yeah, maybe we can have smart contracts and oracles next, because I think those are fairly brief. Will or Nick, are you good to? Is Nick here? Yeah, Nick's in.
Yeah, I can hop in. Just give
Okay,
an update real quick. It's short. We were today, or this week, progressing on deploying Lint to Codeban and testing, and then later deploying it at the end of this month. Hopefully deploying Lint, but Aave has asked us to consider to postpone consideration for a later MIP cycle. So we're going to do that. We're going to postpone to maybe September, I think. But I don't have any. We'll reassess the token in the same way that we did with the ERC20 assessment at a later date. But I just wanted to inform, and then it won't be going out in this governance cycle.
Cool. So just to confirm, because Juan was saying he couldn't understand you very well. So you're saying the Lend token will not be onboarded this month due to the upgrade, is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, I think that concludes. I mean, I guess, do you want to talk briefly about like the reasons? Yeah, Marianne, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, so much like Maker did a few years ago, that we had the old MKR token and we migrated to a new one. Aave is going to be doing the same. They will be migrating Lend to Aave tokens. I think one Lend is going to be 100 Aave. It's going to be an optional migration, but we expect most people to eventually do that because it's going to help. You know, the Aave token is going to be used for their Aavenomics and probably some other things. So if we put Lend now and then, you know, there's some migration in a month, we decided that it's easier to just wait 1 or 2 months for this and then just onboard the Aave token instead. We're in contact with the Aave team. They're gonna give us access to the token contract early so we can start checking it as soon as possible. And then we do the actual Aave onboarding, but that's pretty much it.
Thanks for that. Nick, do you want to do your quick updates on the Gitcoin light feed, I believe?
Yeah, sure. First, I kind of wanted to spend a minute talking about Rich, though, Mr. Rich Brown.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys know this, but for those of you who have been, in the kind of maker governance community for a long time, maker governance just used to be a bunch of like hungover early 20-year-olds like showing up on a Sunday morning and just shooting the shit. And Rich Brown is really, the reason that we're kind of here today and have this like, formalized governance process, that's very even just community driven. And, this did not just, organically kind of come about. This was, very much orchestrated by the master Rich Brown. So if you guys want to ping Rich after this meeting or something, I'm sure it would make him really squeamish and uncomfortable, just to thank him how much he's really done for the community. And fun fact about Rich actually comes from a long line of maker people that have basically hired themselves. There was never a job posting for, hey, we need a Rich, and Rich applied, and then we interviewed a Rich. Rich was one of those people that just started hanging around in the Rocket chat a bit too much for a normal person, and just kind of started to do stuff. And then eventually it was like, well, we kind of need him to keep doing stuff. I respect the hell out of the maker guys that came in this way, through the maker gravity well, exactly. But yeah, I'll stop there, to stop making Rich blush, because I can tell he's like squirming around a bit. He's moving a little too much. So maker oracles. So we had a slight issue with Gitcoin. Right, we had voted Gitcoin in as a light feed, I believe, beginning of July. And one of the things they did is they provisioned their VPS that was running their Oracle feed with way too little storage space. So I think they had 8 gigabytes of storage, and the OS was taking up 7.7. And so it quickly just blew up, and they managed to lock themselves out, where they couldn't actually get into the box because they just screwed up the partition so bad. So anyways, this in combination with that they never backed up their keys means that basically that entire key that they were using to sign their Oracle prices is basically just gone up in smoke. So we need to do an executive vote to basically swap their old key for the new key. And so if you go on the Oracle forum, if you go to the application, the thread where Gitcoin submitted their application, you'll see that Kevin Onoki, the co-founder, or actually founder of Gitcoin, has submitted a signed message with his new key from his MakerDAO forum account, saying that he wants to swap the key. So I've talked to Kevin. We've already set up the new feed on a much better hardware provisioned VPS. And he's already been signing messages for the past week and a half with the new keys, and everything looks stable. So it's just a matter of basically lifting the new key and removing the old key. So it's quite a simple swap to make. But we'll definitely remind all of the feeds that if they don't have to, to exercise proper key management, because I kind of thought this went without saying, but apparently we still need to remind people. But Kevin's a great guy, so no harm, no foul. These types of situations are going to come up, and it's just good that we have kind of smooth processes for dealing with them. Second order of business, the Argent proposal to become a light feed just passed as well this morning. So we'll be having them get set up over the next week or so. So expect an executive vote probably in 2 weeks, maybe 1 week, but more than likely not 2 weeks to vote them in on chain as well. And that's it for me.
Cool. Thank you, Nick. Anyone have comments or anything on that before we move on? Looks like no. Okay. Let's see. Cool. Okay. So we can move on to kind of the more interesting governance-y things now. I think we'll start with money supply and a update on the vault compensation stuff. Money, are you there and available?
Yep. Am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Okay, perfect. So just a really brief update on the vault compensation process. The poll last week failed by about 25,000 to 17,000 with 33 voters. Participation was down over half based on the amount of maker voting as well as independent voters. I think the original poll back in April was about 62,000 yes to 33,000 no. So participation was definitely way down. And then over the past week, we've gotten a little bit of feedback in the forums, kind of potential things that might get more support for the poll going forward. So we've heard from some people that there might just be too many steps and votes, too much governance overhead, which is maybe making it less appealing to maker voters. So you know, possibly making it a little bit simpler and just fewer steps might be good. There's also feedback about not really having clarity at the very beginning about potential costs, which would have been made clear, you know, later in the process if it had been approved, but it's still a fair concern that people might want to have a better idea about costs up front. Also heard some feedback that there just might not have been enough time or kind of like awareness built about the vote. So I heard some people suggest maybe trying to get more publicity on it if we rerun another poll in the future, possibly a longer voting period, maybe like 1 to 2 weeks instead of just a couple days. I think MakerMan had mentioned maybe even seeing if we could just wait until we get a minimum quorum, you know, enough MKR voting on it before we close it. I'm not sure if that's feasible technically, but just kind of as an idea. And then there was a little bit of feedback just about people not having total clarity about the dividing line between MakerDAO and the Maker Foundation, and you know, who would be responsible and where money would be coming from and where money should be coming from. So that was most of the feedback that I think that we got in the forums. My take on that is that you know, how much overlap is there between the people who are providing feedback and the people who voted no? You know, you can't be sure, but my guess is not that high. So some of these ideas are kind of speculative about what might make it more appealing to maker voters. And then as far as next steps, I think the working group, including myself, we're just going to need to discuss over the weekend and give at least some sort of status update early next week. And then anyone else who continues to have feedback, definitely please go ahead and share in the vault compensation thread or the updates thread. And that's all I got.
Right, thank you, Mane. Anyone comments or questions about that? Okay, it looks like no. Again, there's discussion threads on the forum for this subject, so if you think of something later, by all means share it there. All right, let's move on to I guess the important stuff. So I'll start with just a brief kind of clarifying statement about how the PSM stuff's going to work now, considering the statement from the foundation. So I previously stated that we would have another vote next week about the PSM parameters, and it would then be included in executive either the week after or the week after that. Seeing as the foundation is no longer developing it, that's probably going to be that's probably not going to happen. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to vote on the parameters when any community implementation probably isn't going to be ready within a reasonable time, right? So like if we vote on parameters now, we could very well find that the sort of the market situations and conditions have changed. And actually, I don't know why I'm saying this because the poll failed, so technically we'd stop now anyway. So in addition to all this, the poll failed slightly. So we won't be having any further votes on chain on the PSM for the time being. That said, if the community do want to pursue it separately from the foundation, there are avenues we can start to work on to pursue that if the community wants to. Any implementation will probably have to go through the MIPs process at this point, and a good start for that might be a declaration of intent through MIP 13, trying to confirm whether maker holders want the PSM, which may be a little bit difficult to get through considering the recent vote. But that would be the place to kind of try and resolve any, resolve the complaints those who voted have against it. Does anyone have any questions about how PSM stuff is going to proceed? Because I want to make sure that's as clear as possible, I guess. Okay, looks like no. So I guess with that out of the way, we should maybe start discussing the PEG. I know Cyrus is here. Cyrus, I know you didn't plan to say anything, but if you want to say anything, you're welcome to.
Bye.
Sorry, was that a yes or a? Can't hear you there, Cyrus. Okay, yeah, no worries. Okay. All right, so yeah, if anyone else wants to start the conversation about the PEG and or PSM, feel free.
Yeah, so with my poll that I put out yesterday, I'm thinking maybe we can lower the USDCA liquidation ratio to try and get more collateral moving through that venue to mint more DAI. To me, it seems like a lot of this farming behavior, if people want to stay in stable coins and they're looking at, say, comp, for example, and they want DAI for comp, there's kind of two mechanisms that they want to stay in stable coins. There's USDC and there's there's buying DAI on the market and there's minting DAI through USDC. So I'm thinking we should make USDC as attractive as possible so that we prevent this market buying behavior. So please respond on that thread.
Yeah, I responded in the chat group earlier, but I definitely agree that going down the path you mentioned makes sense. Getting USDC as a mechanism to have market makers want to take arbitrage in that space will help adjust the PEG back down. The real solution is a market-driven solution.
Is my mic working now? Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think most people
generally agree that, sorry about the background noise, that we need to be increasing the supply right now. But I just want to make sure that everyone kind of understands that the current demand is almost certainly likely to alleviate by the end of this weekend. So a big source of the recent surge has been the YFI farming, or the YIFI farming, which has generated extreme demand for DAI. And I think that's scheduled to stop either Saturday or Sunday. I think what is like some 100 million DAI is sitting in that contract. When that unwinds, I'm expecting to see a lot of that DAI return back to where it came from. So we saw the compound utilization ratio increase significantly, and just basically all the main sources of DAI liquidity were kind of getting tapped out. I mean, like a somewhat more conservative option would be to just wait a few days to see how that unwind looks, because before the YIFI farming started, I think the DAI peg wasn't great, but it was at the very least under 101. So yeah, I just want to caution from kind of some sort of extreme overreaction when in just a few days we should be seeing some lightening up of the pressure anyways. But it's not, I mean, this is just kind of a best guess on my part.
We also haven't hit the cap on the total amount of usage of USDC. I mean, as of right now, it's some 28 million out of a debt ceiling for 80. So there's still plenty of utilization capable in that area. By lowering that collateralization ratio, we just have to be mindful that it creates an exponential effect of how much leverage you can get out of it. I don't even remember off right now what the collateralization ratio is, but I know there were discussions to pull it down to 110 or even lower, and it just it is a good issue. It magnifies the benefits for it. We just have to be mindful because we take more risk when we do it.
Yeah, I would say even going down to like 110% may have a fairly large effect, because those who are looking to move into DAI through USDC, paying like a 1 or 2 cent premium is not that much. When looking at these yields, they're like 1,000% sometimes. It's pretty insane. So having to lock up 20% extra collateral as opposed to just buying it on the market may not seem like a very attractive option at this point. So going down to 110, 105, even that, which I think we can do, may help a lot to alleviate this upward pressure.
It seems that the DAI peg slipping seemed to coincide with the post yes about PSM being abandoned by the foundation.
It's maybe coincidental. I mean, we can get effectively the PSM, at least in one direction, by lowering to a collateral ratio that is close to 100%. Like if we kind of went to 100 or 101%, it would be pretty close to being similar to what the PSM would do for us at this stage.
Well, it's worth a try.
So a couple of other good points were made in the side chat. Does anybody want to share those on the mic?
Yeah, when the peg goes this high, it reduces the desire of people to borrow in DAI because they're facing they're facing issues. If they borrow 30,000 in DAI and the peg slips a couple points, they may lose thousands of dollars pretty quickly. So the peg not being in control really does affect demand for borrowing DAI, especially demand to borrow DAI to bet on assets. And it's really only, the yield farming stuff doesn't affect the peg very much. The thing that affects the peg is when DAI is used to buy assets like Ether on the market, because that brings the peg down, and yield farming doesn't really have that feedback loop.
It's worth noting that if people buy DAI to use in yield farming, then it does have that effect. So it's not entirely separated, I would say.
Yeah, I don't think people are buying DAI for the most part. I think mostly they're borrowing it.
For the farming, yeah, so there's kind of two key points here. So the buying ETH will definitely have sort of a negative pressure on the peg to go down, but it's also equally, maybe not equally, but it's also effective to prevent upward pressure from market buys to use for this farming. I wouldn't say that it's clear that people aren't market buying to get into DAI for specifically this farming.
Yeah, so I was gonna wait till a little bit later, but there's two important clarifications there. One is when people buy DAI, which some people do, to chase yield, to deposit into pools, etc., it 100% drives up the price of DAI. And the other point is, even if they're not specifically purchasing DAI, if they're taking DAI that would otherwise have been sold and dumping it into these farming yield platforms, it's also drying up the liquidity and driving price up. So both ways to Sunday, like you're driving up the price through farming, and that's pretty clear.
Vishesh, do you have?
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm happy to just jump in with that. Yeah.
Yeah, go for it. We can maybe see some data and things.
Sure.
1 sec. There you go.
Okay. So to start from the top, total DAI debt ceiling across multiple collateral assets. You have the room for 345 million DAI to be minted. Right now, 235 million DAI has been minted. 184 million of that is DAI from ETH, 3 million from BAT, 26 from USDC, 20 from WBTC, and then a little bit from KNC. So we'll kind of double click on what's been going on there. So one interesting thing to note is in the last few days, the BAT DAI pool was pretty much capped out at about 3 million. WBTC has basically remained sustained at 20 million. And USDCA, so basically it was steady for a while. A small increased amount was minted in the last couple of days. And then basically a big chunk of that, about half, was cleared out overnight. And then there were a few small mintings again, bringing it back up, about halfway to where it was before, around 30 million. So that's what we're looking at here in terms of WBTC being capped out and USDCA being utilized only about a quarter of what it could be at 26 million. So that's where some of the conversation, I think, is warranted around USDC and how much it's actually being utilized. And then KNC, obviously, there's a small amount that's just kind of been a steady increase as well. ETH, so basically what you sort of see here is after March 12th events, there was sort of that steady recovery and growth. And then basically around July 2nd, a lot of the comp farming stuff started to hit. And then we see, a few days ago, a lot of the YIFI farming and other other types of yield that have emerged, I think probably precipitated a further acceleration to jumping straight up 20 million, more or less overnight. So that brings our total ETH supply up to 184 million. So just to look at where some of this stuff is going. So Compound, what we see now is we've dropped to a net 27 or so million DAI being supplied there. Curve, so this has been, obviously an increasingly important topic lately, and it's where a lot of attention has gone in the last few days. So you can sort of see here is the DAI deposits in Curve. That's grown rapidly over the last couple of days. A lot of this is for the EFE farming activity that's been going on. And we look at Balancer as well. You can sort of see here the trading volume in these pools as well has exploded for DAI compared to even its previous peak in June. It's just nothing. It was nothing before compared to what it has been in the last few days, and that makes a lot of sense because it's pretty frothy. There's a lot of yield to be had there. And if we sort of look at the impact on the peg, so we'd sort of already been talking about this kind of sustained elevation at $1 to $2 with sort of periodic run-ups in between, and then basically in the last 24 hours, honestly more like the last 18 hours, we saw basically a increased volume of trades at $1.03, $1.04. That was also reflected in some of the other pairs than just ETH, but it's basically the same trend where you sort of see the $1, $2 mark, and then in the last 24 hours or so, just a huge volume at elevated prices. And this sort of, and same thing you can see reflected on the current order books for DAI USDC on, say, DYDX. It's sitting at about $1.03 right now. So a couple of things to touch on. In the grand scheme of things, this is a not representative of what the previous peg problem was. So the previous peg problem was dealing with the $1, $2, and then this has sort of been an overnight trend at $3, $4. Whether that's actually going to be sustained at $3, $4 is questionable, or whether this is a short-term movement, and that's something that's important to keep in mind, because I know multiple different trends have a tendency to bleed together in people's minds. I'm not saying that overnight this is going to drop back down to $1, but it may over the next couple of days level back out to $1, $2. We'd have to wait and see. It's not clear that there's any reason that this would remain sustained at $3, $4. So unpacking, as we alluded to earlier, unpacking a little bit of why that's occurring. So there's a couple of things. One, if you consider sort of the DAI liquidity that exists out there, looking at the, say 13 to, say 13 or so million that was, because some of this has moved to other pools, so that's just something to keep in mind. 13 or so million that was being dumped on Curve, the 20-some million that was dumped on Compound for comp farming was a larger number before. Again, as we talked about when the comp farming started to blow up, as these yields shift, so too does the money. And so basically you have a lot of this yield chasing behavior going on right now where people are not particularly married to the platforms where they're dumping their DAI right now. They're just chasing whatever is the most attractive yield short term. So these could be very impermanent trends, and that's again an important thread to keep in mind. And the question of how much those will remain sustained upward price pressures on DAI is a question of how much these yields will remain sustained and available to DAI holders. So right now, what's going on basically is, yes, a portion of people are purchasing DAI to dump into these platforms and get that yield. Also, a huge chunk of DAI is being minted to be dumped into these platforms. But more importantly, very little DAI is being minted and being sold on the open market. And so that sort of trifecta there is why you have this elevated price pressure. That should be pretty clear and obvious, I think, to most people. So the questions right now are, A, how long will those price pressures last? B, what can and does the maker community want to do about DAI liquidity right now and getting more DAI out onto the open market? And C, like, how much of an impact will that have on the peg? And C is like pretty much nested within B, in the sense that the amount of price impact that increased supply, or more importantly, increased market liquidity for DAI would have on the peg is primarily a function of how much people are willing to actually relinquish that DAI and sell it in order to arb the current profit. The problem right now is a 3 or 4% haircut is something that people are very willing in the short term to take in order to get access to crazy 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 600% yields on some of these platforms. Those yields are likely to dry up, as Cyrus mentioned, very soon. And so will the next yield come up? Questionable. Like, it's hard to say. Probably not to that same extent, but it appears to be.
Looks like the YFI yield will be finishing up Friday, Saturday, but it looks like M stable is going to have a yield over 100% annual. I mean,
yeah, it was basically, so IFI is it's a slightly outsized yield right now, I think, compared to some of the other ones that are available. So it's maybe an extra large sink because it's a bit atypical, but it does appear to be a continuing trend, like that's kind of kicked off with some of the comp farming stuff, to have these very large attractive yields available. There's a question of why that's happening as well, and if you sort of take a step back and think about it, like, why DAI, right? Why DAI for these yield farming ventures? And a large portion of it boils down to the fact that at the end of the day, yes, DAI is visible, it's interoperable, it's integrated into a lot of these platforms, but also it's a asset with a comparatively small volume and a comparatively small supply. In addition to the fact that, it's a lot of things that I've mentioned before as to why DAI seems to naturally carry a premium with it, in terms of the nature of it being like an implicit option, the nature of the fact that it has access innately to certain yields outside of all of this farming stuff, and the fact that it is, it's basically a call option on illiquidity for when liquidations happen, et cetera. There's going to be a demand crunch on DAI, and so people have a tendency to hold it, potentially in the hopes of making profit in those times as well. So there's a lot of reasons why DAI has been kind of sustaining an elevated premium, and why it's worth more than holding one USDC lately. Now you throw on top of that the fact that all of these farming opportunities exist, and it only exacerbates the premium. Now, if DAI was as proliferated and had as large of a supply as, say, USDC, it probably wouldn't be as attractive as a target for some of these farming opportunities. So, and that coupled with the fact that it's actually a pretty well-used asset with very decent transaction volumes for its supply. So it's important to consider that it's a potentially sustained trend for there to exist farming opportunities on DAI, even though what's currently happening this week may be a bit atypical. That's just what I want to put in context. So just to kind of round this out, to look at the impact that this is having on the underlying collateral supply, and we're talking a lot about monetary policy, price, premiums, and usage, but also considering the underlying risks that are being underwritten by maker holders and the system for all of this minting that's going on as well. So interestingly enough, in the last week, the ETH collateralization has gone up. Now, very simply put, ETH price is also gone up. So that's probably primarily a function of just the ETH price. But there's also been vaults that have lowered their collateralization ratios in that same time frame. So it's important to consider that what goes up comes down, and what we've seen, quite a bit in the past is when ETH price rises suddenly, it potentially has the tendency to come back down a bit as well. And in the elevated ETH price, what we've also seen is increased amounts of DAI living at some of these lower collateralization ratios. So what that means, if you've kind of been following what's been going on with DAI for the past year, is okay, there could be some liquidations, and that's a risk to be aware of as well. So at 220, you'd have 12 million DAI being liquidated. At 150, you'd have 90 million DAI being liquidated, 92 million DAI being liquidated. So those are big jumps. Yes, it's comparatively small amount at kind of what is a more realistic price drop if the price were to suddenly drop, but $150 is not completely out of the realm of reason for ETH, and it's important to consider that is in percentage basis, it's not completely unheard of in terms of the risk that the DAI ETH portfolio has maintained in the past, but in nominal terms, like that is huge, and so there's a question of what would happen if you were to have a price drop in ETH and a massive liquidation event to DAI, and given the liquidity problems out there right now, and given just the degree of DAI that's kind of locked up in a lot of farming at the moment, that could be a potential problem to be aware of. So that's the ETH portfolio. USDC is a bit boring in terms of collateral. I'll just skip that for time's sake. WBTC, I mean, if there was a small disruption in the, I know this is potentially not even worth mentioning, but if there was a small disruption in the price for WBTC, there would be a pretty decent amount, about 10 million or so, that would be liquidated. And then BAT, in terms of collateralization, is actually a very well collateralized asset pool. So I don't think there's a lot of risk there. Yeah, okay, so I know there's a lot to unpack there. Just in terms of data or kind of the math of what's going on, I'd be happy to double click on anything specific that people maybe want to see more of. Otherwise, I'm sure there's a lot of further discussion about things that's going to continue to go on. So I would kind of pass the baton there. But if there's anything somebody wants to see more of, I'm happy to double click.
I just wanted to make one quick point about the comp farming and why it's DAI specific. And that entirely comes from the interest rate curve and how compound governance has set that. They have a very, very low interest rate up until 90%. And then there's a discontinuous kink at that point. And it's because of that structure that it causes DAI to be the most attractive. So they could totally change that if they want.
Thank you for the presentation, Vishesh. It was very informative as usual. We've seen a couple of things come up in chat. Does anybody who mentioned something interesting in chat want to share it on the mic?
I can just bring you guys through the quick discussion we just had in the sidebar about gas prices.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it remains to be seen whether or not this is actually going to impact the DAI peg. But just if you already have a vault right now and your collateral is already locked, and you want to generate DAI against it, on the sort of slow price right now, which is over 100 Gwei, I just got a price quote of about $10.50 just to generate DAI, which means you need to generate at a reasonable volume in order to even start to approach like a good arbitrage. And then if you take the full cycle, like someone that's got a lock collateral, generate DAI, sell the DAI in the market, and then wait and figure they may be paying high gas prices to then buy DAI back and pay their vault down. That for an entire probably tier of retail arbitragers, I would say it may mean that it's just not economical for them. That the arbitrage isn't good enough at 1% or 2% or 3% above peg. So, but Nick brought up a good point, which is that most of the arbitrage is probably happening by whales anyway. And so once you get to a certain volume of DAI, it should be irrelevant. The gas price should be irrelevant. So that was the sidebar discussion that you had during the peg.
Cool. Thank you, Chris.
There was also a discussion about whether or not it's called Wi-Fi or Yiffy or Wiffy or yeah.
That's probably one that can stay in the sidebar.
Well, okay. I think those are some. That was a great summary, Vishesh, of what's going on. I guess for me, I mean, this is just my view at this point. What I'm kind of waiting to figure out from governance is how aggressive they want to be with any changes, such as the liquidation ratio, or if they want to kind of wait a few days to see how the unwind of the Yiffy farming happens. I also wanted to highlight that, like in the past, just in the past day, we've seen a lot of DAI being generated, especially from the recent debt ceiling increase. So it's not really as if DAI supply is slowing down or anything. I don't really have a strong view one way or another, but I do think that some sort of informal consensus could be really useful at this point.
With regards to the signaling thread I put up, I've delayed the vote until next Wednesday. So we can wait until and see what happens on Saturday.
Yeah, so maybe
do we have,
good.
Sorry, do we have any executives going out on Friday right now? We have 2 next week that we know of, right? It's going to be a Monday and a Friday. But do we have anything planned for this Friday?
I think we do. I think we have the Gitcoin thing Nick mentioned and possibly something else.
Yeah, there are a couple of things regarding oracles, but did anything pass with regards to you know, risk premiums, base rates, anything like that?
I'll just double check. I think they're both 0 still.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say if there wasn't too much competition in this week's executive, that maybe we did want to just create a really quick ad hoc bundle set. Ultimately, Maker governance gets to decide whether or not they want it anyway. But, you know, we'd be able to possibly do the USDC collateralization ratio, maybe the BAT debt ceiling, something like that. It would break our normal flow, but, you know, we're at 103 right now.
So that's maybe a good point for me to go over how it's going to happen again. So this was, so I kind of said this before, but I'll repeat it again. In order for us to do something outside of the governance cycle, we need to, in some way, say that it is an emergency. Currently, this can either happen from Cyrus or a risk team saying that they think it's an emergency, or it can happen if there's a poll on the forum that gets a majority saying we think this is an emergency and we want to do this thing. Given that all the things we're discussing are stuff we've done before, I don't think there's any reason to make it more than 50%. So if people want to see emergency action in some form, then you would need to create a request on the forum and get people to agree that we need emergency action for this. Anybody got any questions about that?
How detailed would that signal have to be?
Okay, yeah, that's a fair point. I would prefer if it said like what we wanted to do as an emergency measure. But we have had more general ones in the past where we've said like, we think we're in an emergency situation and we want to do things generally. So it could be a little bit flexible. I would much prefer if there was a specific proposal though.
So with regards to the signal thread, there does seem to be the vast majority of people wanting to lower it to some number, if that helps. Cyrus would need to make that call if it's an emergency though.
Yeah, so I think Cyrus's point has been that he would take like leadership from the community in this case. So I think based on what Cyrus said, it's a reasonable assumption to create a poll asking whether we want to do this as an emergency action or not.
Okay.
Just one point that somebody brought up in chat. So something that I forgot to mention was, or didn't quite make clear was, so this comp farming yield has existed. In the last few days, we've seen this extra elevation of the price. So we had to ask ourselves, what's changed in that time frame? Well, it's primarily all this Wi-Fi farming activity. That has a defined expiration date on it. Of course, there's other farming yield that will exist after that, but it doesn't appear to be quite at the same rate that will exist. So it seems like there's a strong case for sort of waiting to see what happens in a few days. I'm not going to tell people how they should choose to respond to that, but in terms of what trends are likely to continue, there's at this point reasonable doubt as to whether that's actually a long-term trend. It hasn't even piped its way into the 24-hour moving price yet. Like that's you know, sort of like a 12-hour trend. So acting on that in terms of emergency action, questionable, but in terms of whether that's actually the current sustained trend, that does not appear to be clear right now.
Well, it's been 6 months, well, 5 months since the peg went above $1, and so whatever has happened over that, we haven't been below $1 since then.
Yes, but is that what we're talking about solving right now, or right now. I don't know, we're mixing threads there, but it seems like the current question was about the $3, $4 price, which has not been the case for 6 months. I mean, if I'm confusing the issues, then sorry, but it just seemed like those were two separate questions.
Yeah, I'm looking at lowering the liquidation ratio as just sort of a general mechanism to alleviate like this past few months comp farming altogether.
I think just having the peg at $1.03 and going up probably constitutes a crisis of in the peg going down and the potential of global settlement. I mean, there are other factors that come into play whether people want to borrow DAI, and one of them is whether they can be confident that they can pay it back, you know, at a rate of $1 versus $1.10 or what have you, or is it going to get globally settled? So
but having the liquidation ratio lowered and having something that's a hard number to trade off will directly help that.
So just to make sure that we're keeping the questions clear, the first question was, okay, sustained peg elevation, what to do about it? Second question was the $3, $4 price, is that an emergency? And so my point about the $3, $4 price is it's yet to even, you know, be sustained for 24 hours. So there's a question there as to whether that is actually what the peg is at or whether this is a short-term spike, right?
Yes, and so it's almost like a general question of there is, when the price has been, when the price is volatile like we had earlier in March with the event, you know, there's an implicit bias that if the fundamental collateral is Ethereum or ETH and you borrow against it, if you're concerned the price might drop precipitously, you just tend not to borrow as much as you would. There's a natural bias for it to be above 1, slightly above 1, until we add enough collateral that it creates a diverse portfolio that helps to pull it down. But one of the core mechanisms that can do that.
I'm not sure it's the collateral portfolio that actually necessarily dictates that. Again, I don't want to pontificate too much on like the long-term component at the moment. I was I want to let you finish, but yeah, I just wanted to clarify. It wasn't necessarily about the collateral. It was more the fact that in the long term, there's this potential premium that exists due to the fact that DAI is the usage of DAI, right? So if we harken back to last year, we were having sort of the flip conversation about DAI when it was below the peg, and the concern there was that DAI was much more so used for leverage than it was being used for actual transactions, and you know, in terms of accounting and store value, et cetera. And so at that time, the conversation was, well, too many people are dumping DAI onto the market to just sell it and rewrap for leverage. There's now a different way to get yield, which involves, instead of selling DAI, purchasing DAI. And so it's kind of a mirror problem to what was happening at that point in time.
100% agreed. And I guess my point is now we've hit a cost of capital of ETH at 0, and we don't want to go lower than 0. So
we have this there's a negative cost of capital right now. We're in a negative interest rate market on Ethereum for capital. That's the big part of the problem here. I can borrow money and get paid to borrow money from Compound, and we're getting ready to see that from Aave and these other protocols. I mean, it's a different world.
So right. So it seems the interest there is sort of to talk about the long-term issue. So as far as the long-term issue goes, there's a question of, are you actually going to do anything by minting more supply? And what that primarily has to do with is, are people willing to come in and say, I will take DAI, I will eat whatever the cost is, I will sell it, and I will arb that profit. Primarily, I don't think stability fees are having any impact on the decision-making process, much as they weren't back then for the people that are chasing these yields. Because on a nominal basis, what's the difference between a 300% yield and a 296% yield? Right now, the stability fees are very, very low. I mean, there's very little cost associated to minting DAI for Maker right now, and there's plenty of room in the debt ceilings. So yes, there are questions as to, okay, fundamentally, why are people not doing that right now? That's one set of questions around user behavior. But the other thing is, what's the actual impact of those actions? And if that DAI is not making its way onto the open market, if it's not being sold, if it's minted and used for other things, I get the idea that it's soaking up a little bit of demand, but at the end of the day, it's not really having a price impact. It's not having a short-term price impact. And that's what you're targeting right now. So there's just a bigger thread here as well that I want to bring up in terms of forest for the trees, that chasing this idea of getting more supply minted as a method of solving the peg may be coming at, you know, a square peg with a circle kind of thinking. And so there's maybe a different conversation as well to be had around how are you actually solving the peg problem? Because just getting more DAI minted is not necessarily solving it.
Respectfully, Vishesh, I disagree with that though. So you're right that like the ideal scenario is we want people minting DAI and selling it for ETH or whatever to leverage up. That's what we want. That's the ideal scenario. But it's like, I view it as also beneficial to prevent people from buying DAI to put into these farming opportunities. I'd rather them mint it. So in that sense, increasing the supply does help to prevent the peg from shooting up more than it needs to.
So, okay, so you would like people to mint DAI instead of purchasing it in order to lock up in farming opportunities. There's a question of capital efficiency there. I'm not so sure it will ever be more capital efficient to mint DAI than it will be to just purchase it. There's a price premium and there's the potential loss, but then there's also capital efficiency. If you're going to mint DAI from ETH, for example, the collateralization ratio is what's primarily going to determine whether or not you actually engage in that minting behavior in order to chase that yield.
Yeah, so I completely agree. And that's why I'm advocating we lower the liquidation ratio on USDC.
I'm going to jump in just here if I can, Vishesh. We're approaching 12:30, which is normally when we end the meeting. There still seems to be a fair bit of discussion going on, so I'm happy to extend it like another 15 minutes. I don't want to push it past that though. And everyone feel free to jump off, obviously, if you have things to do. So yeah, feel free, carry on.
Cool. Thanks, LFW. So yeah, in terms of the liquidation ratio for USDC, I mean, it's the other thing is it's comparatively pretty low right now versus some other things that exist in the space, and certainly compared to ETH. So there's a question there though of how low can you go? How low do you want to go? What is your goal? What's your role? Like in terms, well, I'm not trying to rhyme so much. Like, what is your role in this market ecosystem in terms of providing this liquidity to the market? And what's your goal in terms of DAI peg management, MKR holders managing system risk, et cetera? Because you're sort of ratcheting up the amount of risk that the system is underwriting there.
Not necessarily. The collateralization ratio wouldn't change the underlying risk. The debt ceiling is the risk. What's surprising to me is that the utilization of USDC isn't already at 100% right now. I mean, whether or not, I mean, you've got something that has a price that's pegged at 1 in the system. It doesn't matter if we set the liquidation ratio at 150 or 102.
Though, Matthew, that's what I was going to say, was the current utilization is not even at 100%. And my point was, I'm not so sure that dropping that collateralization ratio to anything other than, you know, maybe even 99% would do anything, or would force it to be capped out. Because at the end of the day, it's a fundamental question. It's not a percentage question. Is it ever fundamentally more efficient to lock up collateral in a platform, to mint that asset, and then go dump it somewhere for a short-term yield, versus just getting basically a one-to-one for your capital and buying it on the open market?
So I'm trying to approach that one-to-one by lowering the liquidation ratio down to 101 or 105%. As we approach it, buying it on the market will be less and less attractive because you can just pretty much mint it at one-to-one.
Yeah, and again, that's where you bump up against what's the goal there. I mean, I think it's fundamentally wrong to say that that does not increase risk. It does. There's a question of, okay, if you assume there's zero risk, then there's zero risk, right? But I don't think it's necessarily correct to assume there's zero risk. And so that's a separate point there. DAI being permanently off the peg, right? So I'm just trying to encourage a focusing of the discussion so that you're not necessarily chasing how do we get the most DAI minted versus trying to more directly tackle the problems of DAI on the market, DAI liquidity, people willing to undertake market making behavior, etc. How do you, I think it would be important to ask, how do you best facilitate people market making DAI right now? That's one example.
So here's I guess it's a question, or it's a little bit of a rhetorical comment of, if there is more DAI outstanding, then the overall, whether it's DYDX or compound, the overall yield drops. I mean, that's generally the concept, right? The overall percentage of people who are borrowing it, assuming the quantity of borrowing doesn't change, if there's more supply, the yield goes down.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to consider is it's also shifting a bit from comp farming to other forms of yield, and so that's another important part of the conversation is what impacts those yields. And so, like, you know, does this solution necessarily solve the next thing, etc. And I don't want to belabor because we've sort of gone on very long here. As far as there are multiple threads, as far as emergency action versus long-term solution, I think we're discussing long-term solution here. As far as emergency action goes, I really honestly don't think that you're necessarily going to be able to do anything in the next 2 days that changes the DAI peg in a way that it would not naturally change in the next 2 days. Does that make sense? I'm open to disagree.
I think dropping the peg module had a psychological impact on the peg, and the foundation walking away from the peg stability module, I think it did. I think we saw a change in the price after that happened.
There's a small chance, Matthew, that it also kind of correlates with the Binance announcement today. Like I was just looking at their markets. It looks like they spiked up to 114 at one point for DAI. And I'll mention this when we've seen DAI hit new markets where people don't really know what it is yet. I'm not saying Binance is one of those markets, but we have seen occasions where people trade DAI as though it's like some new fandangled like speculative asset, and they don't realize it's a stablecoin. So there's a possibility that we have some traders on Binance thinking that it's some new speculative asset or that's dragging things up as well. Just adding one other possible correlation.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so sorry, and I just want to make sure you stay focused. The problem right now is nobody's arbing the peg because there's a ridiculously outsized yield available from doing other things with your capital. That's the core problem. So my question is, how are we addressing that problem?
I agree. And in general, that's true. That's what I said about negative real interest rates. I mean, you basically have people paying you to borrow money. So that's the issue right now.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to comment too often on sort of the more speculative components of what's going on, but I just want to make sure that my goal is to always make sure that the community is considering all the possibilities in terms of what's going on, what are the problems, what are the solutions. And so my question right now is just to provoke thought there in terms of making sure you're not chasing a red herring and making sure that you're solving the core problem. And so the core problem to me appears to be right now that nobody's arbing the peg. And what I was just missing there from that whole thread was, what is the actual solution to facilitating more arbitrage behavior of the peg? Right, and I know we're really running late here, so I'm going to sort of leave it at that for the moment.
Well, at some point, it may be necessary for the protocol to arb the peg directly. I mean, let's look at scenarios that could happen. If the peg keeps going up, at some point the options are emergency shutdown, or you know, buying ether on the market with newly created DAI to make the peg go down, or maybe there's some other option. But you know, at some point you get into that scenario.
I also think you're going to find a scenario where, just like on algo trading in the stock market, where it made just a ton of money, which ultimately introduced a ton of market participants that made more money up until the point where they all put themselves out of business. So the yield farming component, while interesting and amazing, at some point it will naturally go away just because of the competition that it creates. And that capital, that arbitrage, will ultimately circle back to things it can do, like people who are just happy making 30% per month on doing a yield arb against the peg, for example.
Yeah, I think one of the things we need to consider is that, yeah, I think I agree that we're talking about something that's long term is probably going to go away, or at least reduce in severity. But we're kind of dealing with a medium term issue where it's probably not.
Oh, why would Compound, for example, why would Compound stop issuing comp tokens? What would drive them to do that?
Because the comp token holders aren't going to be happy being like diluting themselves forever, right? I don't think, at least. Maybe they are, like to some small extent, sure, but I don't think there's going to be as significant as it is currently for a long.
One thing I'd like to mention is that like we have to realize that the allocation of capital has gone to yield farming, and the people who arb this have a lot of money tied up in that yield farming. So for them to go arb the peg like this, it takes away from the other they get less of return on capital. So also we have a significant move in terms of Binance listing DAI, YFI, a whole bunch of things. I think at some point right around here, there's 103, 104. It gets tempting for people who have money outside of who are yield farming will lever up a little further and hit down the peg. I just want to.
Yeah, I mean, so statistics, I mean, it seems like about half the DAI out there is just locked up in specifically the Wi-Fi farming activity right now. So, and then that's not counting, you know, what's locked up in comp. So yes, 100%. That's what the numbers are showing, is just all the capital out there right now. That's, you know, all the DAI capital out there is allocated to this farming behavior. It's not being used for other things, like, for example, arbitrage. And so that peg movement has been elevated, and it's made it easier for upward price pressures to take hold. That's 100% what's going on. And I guess at the end of the day, that's my job, is to help communicate what's going on.
So just Vishesh, how much money is actually in aggregate, and I don't have the numbers, in aggregate, are moving around on a daily basis as a part of this comp farming yield?
I mean, so comp, there's a net 27 or so million locked in comp, and then there's I'd have to check. I think like another 100 million in.
No, I mean, I'm talking about it, including all the daily trade volume from Curve and from Balancer. I guess what I'm trying to get at, while it feels horrible that the peg has drifted from 101.2 to 103 now, we might also take into consideration that that may be $700 million or 700 million DAI of transactional volume a day that's only causing the DAI peg to move by 0.01. That actually might be a reflective point about how stable the system is, even with how much capacity is moving around in it.
Yeah, I mean, so at the end of the day, there's a question of price points, and it's important to keep perspective. Thanks, Matt. But so there's 100 million DAI, right? So as Matthew Light shared, 100 million DAI, over 100 million DAI in the Wi-Fi pools across Balancer and Curve. The fact that that did not cause a larger price movement is important perspective to consider as well. It's about numbers. Like, you know, at what price? Like, would you buy DAI at $1.05, $1.06 in order to lock it up and get, yes, you know, say 600% yield annually, but over the next few days that you have access to that? And so there's just a calculus there of what degree of profitability justifies that behavior. And so important takeaways there is obviously that crazy yield is short term. There will be other yields, but they will definitely be significantly lesser after this sort of dries itself out. And then, yes, there's 100% a long-term question that needs to be tackled there in terms of what to do about the fact that DAI is sustained an elevated $1, you know, 1.5, say on average price. So I'm going to sort of leave it at those takeaways, and then I know we're gone way over time.
Yeah, maybe that's a good point in which to wrap it up then, because as you say, we are getting to the point where we should just stop. All right, I would like to thank everyone for coming, and hope to see you all again at the next meeting. If you do want to see action happen on the peg or on something else, the forum is the place to go to discuss. As I said previously, if people want to see emergency action, then there needs to be a thread, a signal thread, requesting that specifically. All right, thank you again, everyone, and I'll see you all soon.
Great job, everyone. Thanks, Long for Wisdom. Thanks.
Cool. Bye, guys. Thank you.